My son was standing on my front porch with a certified letter crushed in his fist. His face was red. His voice was louder than I had ever heard it. "You replaced me with Emily," he shouted, "after everything I've done for this family." I was still weak from surgery. The incision across my abdomen pulled every time I breathed too deeply. I should have been frightened by the anger in his eyes. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Daniel had not come to ask whether the cancer had spread. He had not come to ask whether I could sleep, eat, or walk without pain. He had come because something he believed would always belong to him had changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Thomas Bennett. I was 60 years old, widowed for 8 years, and working as a maintenance supervisor at a community college outside Columbus, Ohio, when a routine appointment turned into the worst week of my life. For months I had been tired. Not ordinary tired. The kind of tired that made climbing one flight of stairs feel like hauling lumber uphill. Then came the stomach pain, the weight loss, and the blood work that showed severe anemia. A colonoscopy found the tumor. The surgeon said it appeared operable, but he wanted to move quickly. My employer's health plan would cover most of the cost, but I had not met my deductible. Before the hospital could schedule the operation, I needed to arrange a payment of $3,500. I had some savings, but most of it was tied up in retirement accounts, and the modest house my late wife Margaret and I had spent 25 years paying off. So I called my son. Daniel was 36, married, and doing well in commercial insurance. He and his wife Rachel had just made an offer on their first home. When he answered, I told him everything. The diagnosis, the surgery, the amount. There was a long silence. Then he said, "The doctor said your chances aren't good." That isn't what he said. "My wife and I just used our savings for the down payment on a house." I waited. Finally, he said, "Dad, I don't have the money." I did not argue. I did not remind him of the years I had helped with tuition, car repairs, and rent. I simply said, "I understand." That evening, my daughter Emily knocked on my door. She was 32, divorced, raising a 10-year-old girl, and working as an elementary school secretary. She placed an envelope on my kitchen table. "Dad," she said softly, "here's $2,000. I stared at her. Because I knew one thing immediately. Emily could not afford to give me that money. And in that moment, everything changed. I pushed the envelope back across the table. "No," I said, "absolutely not." Emily gently slid it toward me again. "Yes." I looked at her then, at the worn envelope. It wasn't thick enough to hold $2,000 comfortably. Every crease seemed to tell its own story. "Emily," I said quietly, "where did this come from?" She hesitated. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." She lowered her eyes before answering. I emptied my emergency savings. I felt my stomach tighten harder than the cancer ever had. "Emily." She smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "My car can wait." I knew exactly which car she meant. A 12-year-old Honda Civic with nearly 200,000 miles on it. Every few months, something else seemed to break. Last winter, the heater stopped working for almost 2 weeks before she could afford to repair it. She had been putting aside a little money from every paycheck, hoping to replace it before another Ohio winter arrived. "Sweetheart," I said, "that money wasn't for me. It is now. You have Lily to think about. My daughter needs her grandfather." The room fell silent. I had spent my entire life believing parents were supposed to protect their children from sacrifice. Now my youngest child was quietly protecting me. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can. What if your car dies next month?" She shrugged. "Then I'll figure something out." It sounded so much like something her mother used to say that I had to look away. Margaret had always believed problems could be solved one day at a time. Emily had inherited that part of her. The next morning, while Emily was at work, I called the hospital's financial counseling office. A woman named Denise patiently explained my options. "If you can make a substantial payment before surgery," she said, "we can usually arrange a monthly payment plan for the balance." "How much?" "If you pay $2,000 now, we can spread the remaining $1,500 over 12 months. I closed my eyes. Emily's sacrifice had done more than raise money. It had made the surgery possible. 2 days later, I signed the payment agreement. The operation was officially scheduled for the following Tuesday. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "Has the surgery been scheduled?" I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "Yes, nothing more." He answered with a thumbs-up emoji. No phone call. No offer to drive me. No question about whether I was frightened. Just a tiny blue thumb floating on my screen. That evening, I began gathering insurance papers and medical forms for the hospital. At the back of my filing cabinet sat a blue folder I hadn't opened since Margaret passed away. Across the tab were 2 words written in black marker. Estate plan. I carried it to the kitchen table. For several minutes, I simply looked at it. Then I opened it. When people hear stories like mine, they usually assume one child is the hero and the other is the villain. Life is rarely that simple. As I sat at my kitchen table with the old blue estate planning folder open in front of me, I found myself thinking less about what my children had done and more about how they had become the people they were. Margaret and I had raised Daniel and Emily in the same house. They had eaten at the same dinner table, gone to the same public schools, been taught the same values, or at least we thought they had. Yet somewhere along the way, they had learned very different lessons. Daniel was 4 years older than Emily. Even as a little boy, he worried about things most children never noticed. If the refrigerator made a strange noise, he'd ask whether we could afford to replace it. If my truck needed repairs, he'd wonder how much it would cost. Margaret used to laugh and call him our little accountant. Emily was different. She noticed people before she noticed problems. If one of her classmates forgot lunch, she'd split her sandwich in half. If a neighbor was sick, she'd ask if we could take over a casserole. Neither child was wrong. They simply saw the world through different windows. Then Margaret got sick. Breast cancer. Daniel was only 17. Emily had just turned 13. For nearly 3 years, our home revolved around doctor appointments, insurance paperwork, prescriptions, and treatments. I worked overtime whenever I could. Margaret fought harder than anyone I've ever known. Daniel watched the savings account shrink month after month. He saw bills piling up on the kitchen counter. He saw me refinance the house to keep everything afloat. I don't think he ever forgot those years. Emily remembered something different. She remembered sitting beside her mother's bed reading aloud from library books. She remembered helping Margaret brush her hair after chemotherapy. She remembered that sometimes the greatest comfort wasn't solving a problem. It was simply refusing to leave someone alone. Looking back, I realized I had probably encouraged both versions of them. Whenever Daniel made smart financial decisions, I praised him for being responsible. Whenever Emily stayed beside her mother for hours without complaining, I thanked her for having such a kind heart. Neither lesson was wrong, but perhaps I had unintentionally taught one child that security mattered most, and the other that presence mattered most. Inside the blue folder were the legal documents Margaret and I had completed years earlier. My will, my living will, my financial power of attorney, my healthcare power of attorney. The name appeared again and again, Daniel Bennett. At the time, it had seemed like the obvious choice. He was organized, careful, excellent with paperwork. I closed the folder and stared at Margaret's photograph on the mantel. For the first time since the phone call, one question quietly settled into my heart. Was the person best at managing money really the person I trusted most to manage my life? That night, just before I went to bed, my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Hope everything goes well Tuesday. I stared at the screen. Then I typed back, thank you, son. Nothing more. Tuesday morning arrived before sunrise. Emily pulled into my driveway just after 5:30. She stepped out carrying 2 travel mugs of coffee and the same calm smile she'd been wearing ever since my diagnosis. You ready? She asked. No, I admitted. But let's go anyway. She laughed softly. I was hoping you'd say that. The drive to Riverside Methodist Hospital was quiet. The roads were nearly empty and the October sky was still dark. Every few miles, Emily would glance over, making sure I was doing all right. Neither of us talked much. Some fears are simply too big for conversation. Inside the hospital, the admissions clerk greeted us with practiced kindness. She reviewed my insurance card, verified the payment arrangement, and handed me a clipboard of consent forms. Emily sat beside me, reading every page before I signed it. Slow down, she said gently. There's no prize for finishing first. I smiled. You sound just like your mother. I hope that's a compliment. It is. In the preoperative area, a nurse reviewed my medications while another started an IV. The surgeon stopped by a few minutes later. The scans still suggest we caught this in time, he said. We'll know more after pathology, but I'm optimistic. Optimistic. It was the first word I'd heard in weeks that made the future feel real again. Just before they wheeled me toward the operating room, my phone vibrated. It was Daniel. I smiled, thinking maybe he'd changed his mind and decided to come. Instead, I opened the message. Closing paperwork is a mess this week. Hope everything goes well. I read it twice. That was all. No, I'm sorry I can't be there. No, call me when you wake up. Just another reminder that buying a house had become the center of his world. I slipped the phone into my bag without replying. Emily noticed the expression on my face but didn't ask. She simply reached over and squeezed my hand. I'll be right here. I know. Those 3 words meant more than she would ever understand. The surgery lasted nearly 4 hours. When I finally opened my eyes in recovery, everything hurt. My abdomen felt as though someone had tied a heavy knot inside it. The room drifted in and out of focus. Then I saw Emily asleep in a chair beside my bed. She was still wearing the same sweater she'd had on before sunrise. An untouched vending machine sandwich rested on the table next to her. She hadn't gone home. She hadn't even gone out for dinner. When she heard me move, her eyes opened immediately. "You scared me," she whispered. I scared myself. A few minutes later, my surgeon came in smiling. "The operation went well," he said. "We removed the entire tumor. We'll wait for the pathology report, but I'm encouraged by what we found today. For the first time since the diagnosis, I believed I might actually have more life ahead of me." That evening, after Emily finally convinced herself to go home and get some sleep, the hospital social worker stopped by my room. She reviewed discharge plans, rehabilitation, and medical paperwork. Then she paused. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "are the people listed on your healthcare documents still the people you trust to make decisions if you can't?" I closed my eyes. For several seconds, I thought about Daniel. Then I thought about the empty chair that had never been empty because Emily had refused to leave it. When I opened my eyes again, I answered honestly, "No, they're not." The social worker's question stayed with me long after she left my room. Not because I didn't know the answer, because I had spent years pretending I didn't. 2 days later, I was discharged with a folder full of instructions, a bag of medications, and a list of restrictions that reminded me I wasn't as strong as I wanted to believe. Emily drove me home. She insisted on carrying my overnight bag while I shuffled carefully up the front steps. "You know I'm still capable of lifting 5 pounds, I joked. She smiled. "Maybe, but you don't have to prove it today." The house felt different. Not because anything had changed, because I had. For the first time since Margaret died, I walked through every room wondering what would happen if I hadn't come home. Who would have made the decisions? Who would have spoken for me if I couldn't speak for myself? The answers no longer brought me comfort. 3 days later, after my follow-up appointment confirmed I was healing normally, I called the attorney who had helped Margaret and me prepare our estate plan years earlier. His name was Richard Hale. He remembered me immediately. "I'm glad you're still with us, Tom," he said warmly. "So am I." When I arrived at his office the following afternoon, I expected him to hand me a stack of forms and ask where to sign. Instead, he closed the file and folded his hands. "Tell me why you're here." So I told him everything. The diagnosis, the phone call, Daniel's refusal, Emily's sacrifice, the empty chair beside my hospital bed. When I finished, Richard remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he asked one question. "Are you making these changes because you're angry?" I thought carefully before answering. "No." "If Daniel had shown up yesterday with flowers and an apology, would you still be sitting here?" I nodded. "Yes." He leaned back. "Then let's talk." For nearly an hour, Richard explained the purpose of every document Margaret and I had signed years ago. A will, irrevocable living trust, financial power of attorney, healthcare power of attorney, living will, beneficiary designations. He reminded me that these documents were never intended to reward success or punish failure. They exist for one reason, he said, to place responsibility in the hands of the person you trust to act in your best interests. That sentence settled something inside me. I didn't ask him to rewrite my estate because Daniel had refused me money. I asked him to rewrite it because the hardest week of my life had shown me who stayed when nothing could be gained. We spent the rest of the afternoon updating every document that controlled medical decisions and estate administration. Richard read each change aloud before I signed. He never rushed me. He asked more than once if I wanted another day to think. "I've been thinking about this since the day my daughter walked through my front door," I said quietly. When everything was finished, Richard closed the folder. "I'll notify everyone who needs to be notified." I thanked him and slowly walked back to my truck. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. 2 days later, someone began pounding on my front door. The pounding didn't stop. Whoever stood on my porch wasn't waiting for an invitation. I pushed myself carefully out of the recliner, every step reminding me that my stitches were still healing. By the time I reached the front door, the knocking had turned into angry pounding. When I opened it, Daniel brushed past me without saying hello. A certified envelope was clenched so tightly in his hand that it had nearly torn down the middle. "What the hell is this?" He threw it onto my coffee table. The law firm's letterhead was impossible to miss. "You replaced me," he demanded. "I changed my legal documents. You made Emily your executor." I closed the front door before answering. "Sit down." "I'm not here to sit down." "No," I said quietly. "You're here to yell." He stared at me for a moment, breathing hard. I lowered myself into the recliner again. Recovering from surgery leaves you with very little energy to waste, and I wasn't about to spend mine arguing. "You could have talked to me first," he said. I tried talking to you. Don't do that. I'm not. He pointed toward the envelope. I've handled your taxes for years. Yes. I've dealt with your insurance paperwork. Yes. I've always helped when you needed financial advice. Yes. Then why would you take all of this away? I looked at him carefully. I didn't take your inheritance away. His jaw tightened. That's not the point. No, sure, I agreed. It isn't. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel said, "This feels like punishment." It isn't. It sure looks like it. I leaned back slowly. When I was lying in that hospital bed, he interrupted me. This is about the money. I shook my head. No. You asked me for $3,500. No. You got mad because I said no. No? His voice grew louder. Then what is this about? Before I could answer, the front door opened. Emily stepped inside carrying 2 grocery bags. She froze when she saw Daniel. I didn't know you were here. Daniel turned toward her immediately. So this was your idea? Emily frowned. What are you talking about? You talked Dad into replacing me. She looked genuinely confused. I didn't even know he'd changed anything. I don't believe you. She quietly set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. You don't have to. Daniel looked back at me. I deserve an explanation. You do. I folded my hands together. Then I asked the one question that had been sitting quietly inside me ever since the day of my surgery. Before you drove over here today, I waited until he looked directly at me. Did you call to ask whether my cancer had spread? His mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence answered for him. Finally, he looked away. He couldn't finish the sentence. I nodded slowly. That's why we're here. Daniel stared at me confused. What does that even mean? I met his eyes. It means you aren't angry about the money. He frowned. Then what am I angry about? I answered softly. You're angry because of what your choices revealed. Daniel didn't understand. Not yet. Daniel looked from me to Emily, then back again. His breathing had slowed, but the anger was still there. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. I think you do. Emily quietly unpacked the groceries without saying a word. She knew better than to interrupt. I picked up the attorney's letter from the coffee table. You've already read this, every word. And what did you learn? His jaw tightened. That you replaced me. I replaced you where he hesitated, as executor. Keep going. As your financial power of attorney. I nodded. Anything else? You made Emily your healthcare agent. That's right. He looked at me with disbelief. You trusted me for years. I did. So why would you do this now? I took a slow breath before answering. Because these documents aren't about who loves numbers. They're about who shows up when life falls apart. Daniel shook his head. So this is because I couldn't lend you the money. No. I've already told you Rachel and I had just emptied our savings. I know. You know how hard we've worked for that house? I do. He spread his hands in frustration. Then why isn't that enough? I looked at him for a long moment. Because I never asked you to solve everything. The room became quiet. I asked for help. You did. You could have said, Dad, I can only afford $500. He stared at me. You could have offered to drive me to surgery. His eyes dropped. You could have brought dinner over after I got home. Emily stopped unpacking. You could have sat beside my hospital bed for an hour. Daniel swallowed. You could have called the next morning. No one spoke. I continued quietly. You could have done 100 different things that cost little or nothing. But you chose none of them. His shoulders slowly lowered. I wasn't measuring your love by $3,500. I was measuring whether I mattered. A tear formed in the corner of Emily's eye. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. I honestly thought he couldn't finish. What? I thought you were asking me to choose between you and my family. I shook my head gently. You are my family. Those 5 words seemed to hit him harder than anything else I'd said. For the first time since he arrived, his anger disappeared. Only shame remained. After several moments, he asked quietly, So, did you leave everything to Emily? I almost smiled. No. His eyebrows lifted. No. I didn't change who inherits from me. I changed who I trust to make decisions if I can't. He looked genuinely confused. I don't understand. You will. I handed him the complete estate planning folder. Sit down. I'm going to explain every change. For the first time that afternoon, Daniel pulled out a chair and listened. Daniel sat across from me with the estate planning folder open between us. For the first time since he'd burst through my front door, he wasn't arguing. He was listening. I pointed to the first document. This is my will. He nodded. You and Emily still inherit everything equally. His eyes narrowed. I do, yes. He quickly flipped through the remaining pages. What about the trust? Still 50-50. The house? The same. What about your retirement accounts? The same. He looked genuinely confused. Then what changed? I folded my hands on the table. You. He looked down again. I don't understand. I opened another document. This is my healthcare power of attorney. It used to be me. It did. And now it's Emily. Yes. I slid the next document toward him. This is my durable financial power of attorney. You changed that too. I did. Then came the successor trustee, the executor. Every position requiring judgment, responsibility, or difficult decisions had been transferred to Emily. Not because she was my favorite, because she had earned my trust. Daniel looked up. You really don't trust me anymore. I shook my head slowly. That's not what I said. Then what are you saying? I'm saying trust isn't something we inherit. He stared at me. It's something we build. The room became quiet again. I continued. When your mother was dying, she asked me one question. Daniel looked surprised. What was it? If something ever happens to you, who will stay? I smiled sadly. Back then I answered your name without hesitation. Emily quietly lowered her eyes. I believe the child who handled money best should also handle everything else. I looked directly at Daniel. I was wrong. He swallowed hard. I've always taken care of paperwork. You have. I've always helped you with taxes. You have. I've never stolen from you. I know. So why wasn't that enough? Because paperwork isn't the hardest job. He frowned. The hardest job is sitting beside someone who's afraid. No one spoke. You weren't there when I woke up. His eyes filled with tears. You weren't there when the surgeon explained what they'd found. His shoulders began to shake. You weren't there when I couldn't get out of bed by myself. I wasn't raising my voice. I didn't need to. You weren't there when Emily helped me shower. Daniel covered his face with both hands. Oh God. You weren't there when she slept in a hospital chair because she was afraid I might not wake up. A tear rolled down his cheek. I kept thinking about the money. I know. I thought protecting my family meant protecting our savings. It probably did. He looked up confused. And what? I understand why you protected your wife. His eyes widened. I really do. You do? Yes. I leaned forward. But you never realized I was your family too. That sentence broke him. He began crying openly. Not because of the will. Not because of the trust. Because for the first time he understood what his own words had sounded like to the man who had spent his entire life protecting him. Daniel cried longer than I expected. Not loud. Not dramatically. Just quietly like a man who had finally run out of excuses. No one said a word until he lowered his hands. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know. No, you don't. He looked at me through red, exhausted eyes. You don't know what I've been carrying. I leaned back in my chair. Then tell me. He took a long breath. When Mom got sick, he began. I watched everything fall apart. I listened. The savings disappeared. I nodded. I remember. I remember hearing you and Mom talking about bills after you thought we were asleep. So do I. I promised myself I'd never let my family go through that. For the first time that afternoon, I truly understood. Daniel hadn't become obsessed with money because he loved it. He had become obsessed with never feeling helpless again. When you called, he continued, all I could think was, what if the surgery didn't work? He wiped his eyes. What if we lost the house we'd worked so hard for and still lost you? The room fell silent. I convinced myself I was protecting Rachel. He looked toward Emily. But the truth is, his voice broke. I was protecting myself. Emily walked over and sat beside him. She didn't hug him. She simply sat there. You know, she said softly, I was scared too. Daniel looked at her. I know. I didn't hand Dad $2,000 because I had extra money. I know. I handed it to him because I couldn't imagine doing nothing. He lowered his head. I know. Emily reached over and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. I'm not angry anymore. He looked surprised. You're not? No. I'm disappointed. He nodded slowly. I deserve that. A few days later, my pathology report came back. The surgeon called personally. The margins are clear, he said. The lymph nodes are negative. We don't believe you'll need chemotherapy. For the first time since my diagnosis, I allowed myself to think about the future instead of simply surviving the present. Daniel drove me to my next follow-up appointment without being asked. He carried my overnight bag. He picked up my prescriptions. When Emily couldn't leave work, he sat beside me in the waiting room. He never mentioned the estate plan again. One afternoon while we were driving home from the hospital, he broke the silence. Dad. Yes, You shouldn't change those documents back? I looked at him. I haven't earned that. I smiled. I wasn't planning to. He nodded. I know. Then after a long pause, he added something I never expected to hear. But I'd like the chance to earn your trust again. For the first time in months, I believed he might. A year has a way of revealing whether an apology was sincere. Anyone can cry for an afternoon. Anyone can promise to change after being confronted. The harder question is whether they're still changing when no one is watching. 1 year after my surgery, I returned to the same hospital for another follow-up scan. By then, I'd regained most of the weight I'd lost. I was back at work 3 days a week, and my surgeon greeted me with a smile before he even opened my chart. I like seeing patients like you, he said. Why's that? Because you're here for a routine checkup instead of another operation. A few hours later, he walked back into the exam room holding my results. Everything looks excellent, Tom. He smiled. No evidence of active disease. I closed my eyes for a moment. Cancer had changed my life, but it wasn't going to take the rest of it. That evening, Daniel and Rachel invited everyone to dinner at their new home. It wasn't a mansion, just a comfortable 3-bedroom house where Lily loved spending weekends with a corner of the backyard she had already claimed as her kingdom. Emily arrived carrying a homemade apple pie. Rachel hugged her at the door. Watching them laugh together reminded me how close we'd come to letting one terrible phone call destroy an entire family. After dinner, Daniel stood up holding a coffee mug. I want to say something. The room grew quiet. He looked first at Emily. I owe you another apology. She smiled gently. You don't have to keep doing this. Yes, he said, I do. He took a slow breath. When Dad called me that day, I thought being responsible meant protecting what I'd worked for. He looked down at his hands. I didn't understand that real responsibility sometimes means showing up when it's inconvenient, when it's expensive, or when you're scared. Then he turned toward me. Dad, thank you for not changing your estate plan back. I raised an eyebrow. Really? He nodded. You were right. No one spoke. I thought inheritance was about what someone leaves you. He smiled sadly. It isn't. It's about the kind of person they teach you to become. Emily quietly reached over and squeezed his hand. For the first time in a long while, I saw my children sitting beside each other instead of standing across from one another. I never restored Daniel as my executor. I never restored him as successor trustee. And he never asked me to. Trust isn't rebuilt because someone feels guilty. It's rebuilt because they keep choosing the right thing long after the crisis has passed. Looking back now, I realize cancer gave me something I never expected. Not gratitude, not perspective. A second chance to teach my children the lesson I should have taught years earlier. Money can protect a house. It can buy insurance. It can build retirement accounts. But it cannot replace a hand held in a hospital room. It cannot comfort a frightened father before surgery. And it cannot heal regret. If my story reminded you of someone you love, don't wait for illness or loss to tell them they matter. The greatest inheritance we leave our families isn't money. It's the example we set when love asks something difficult of us. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences may encourage someone facing a difficult family decision today. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about family forgiveness and second chances, I hope you'll subscribe and join me again. The end.